Paul's lost letter to the Laodiceans, the Bible, differences, expansions, and ancient disagreements. There is a man named Epaphras. You may have passed his name in your reading of the New Testament without pausing, a minor figure, a footnote in someone else's story. But Epaphras is the thread that, when pulled carefully, begins to unravel one of the most quietly astonishing mysteries in all of early Christian history. He was from Colossae. He had traveled to Rome, where Paul was under house arrest, to report on the condition of the churches in the Lycus Valley. A cluster of congregations in what is now Western Turkey, each facing variations of the same theological storm, each needing a response that only Paul could give. Epaphras brought the news. Paul wrote the letters, and when those letters were dispatched, carried by a man named Tychicus, along roads that wound through the dry heat of Asia Minor, two communities received what may have been the most coordinated pastoral intervention in the entire apostolic era. Colossae received its letter. Laodicea received its letter. We still read one of them today. The other has not been seen for nearly 2,000 years. And what it contained, how it differed from what Colossae received, how it expanded on ideas the surviving letter only introduced, what specific wounds it was shaped to heal, remains one of the most fascinating open questions in the history of the New Testament. The reference in Colossians chapter 4 is precise enough to be tantalizing and brief enough to be maddening. Paul writes, almost in the same breath as his personal greetings and final instructions, that the letter coming from Laodicea should be read among the Colossians, and that the Colossians should ensure the Laodiceans receive their letter in turn. He does not explain the content of the Laodicean letter. He does not summarize its argument or preview its themes. He simply assumes it will arrive, assumes it will be recognized as authoritative, and assumes the communities will do the work of sharing it. The casualness of that assumption is itself a clue. This was not an unusual arrangement. Paul coordinated correspondence across multiple communities regularly, but the casualness is also what makes the loss so sharp. He did not mark it as something needing special preservation, because he had no reason to imagine it would not be preserved. And so it wasn't. But that's not the full story. Because the letter to Laodicea was not simply a copy of Colossians with the address changed. These were neighboring cities, only 10 miles apart, close enough that their congregations likely knew one another, shared members, perhaps shared leaders, but they were not identical communities. Colossae was a smaller city, declining economically by the 1st century, its former prominence as a trade hub fading as the larger cities of the region absorbed its commerce. Laodicea, by contrast, was ascending. It was one of the wealthiest cities in the Roman province of Asia, home to a prosperous banking industry, a thriving textile trade built around its famous glossy black wool, and a medical school that produced an eye salve exported across the empire. When an earthquake devastated the region in 60 AD, an earthquake that may have occurred right around the time Paul was writing these letters, Colossae needed outside help to rebuild. Laodicea famously refused imperial assistance and rebuilt entirely from its own resources. The personality of that city is written in that single act of refusal. It was a city that did not ask for help, a city that had learned through generations of material success that self-sufficiency was not merely a strategy, it was an identity. And this is where the mystery deepens, because Paul was not writing to two identical communities facing the same problem at the same intensity. He was writing to two cities whose shared theological crisis, a drift toward hollow philosophy, toward the veneration of angelic intermediaries, toward a diminished Christ surrounded by spiritual bureaucracy, expressed itself through entirely different cultural personalities. Colossi's version of the problem may have been more intellectually driven, more tied to the mystical speculation that tended to flourish in smaller communities with more leisure for theological adventuring. Laodicea's version may have been far more practical in its danger. The quiet assumption, rooted not in philosophy, but in prosperity, that adequate resources on earth translated into adequate standing before heaven. What historians rarely discuss is how dramatically that difference in context would have shaped Paul's response. Colossians, the letter we possess, opens with one of the most elevated Christological passages in the entire New Testament, the great hymn of chapter 1, in which Christ is named as the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, the one in whom all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form, the one through whom and for whom everything that exists was made. That hymn is doing specific theological work. It is dismantling, phrase by phrase, the framework of the false teachers who were inserting angelic powers and cosmic intermediaries between the believer and God. If you believe in a Christ that is this vast, this complete, this cosmically supreme, there is no room left for a hierarchy of spiritual beings requiring appeasement. The hymn is an argument dressed in poetry. Now ask the question that the missing letter forces us to ask. Would Paul have opened the Laodicean letter with the same argument? Or would he have chosen a different theological centerpiece? One calibrated not to dismantle intellectual speculation, but to pierce the armor of material self-confidence. The surviving letter to a later Laodicean generation, John's letter in Revelation chapter 3, gives us a haunting suggestion. John describes a community that believes it is rich and increased with goods and in need of nothing, language that is almost certainly a spiritual diagnosis, using the city's own economic vocabulary as a metaphor. He counsels them to buy from Christ gold refined in fire, white garments to cover their nakedness, and eye salve, the specific product their city was famous for producing and selling to others, so that they might finally see. The irony is surgical. A city renowned for healing other people's eyes is being told it cannot see its own condition. If Paul's letter arrived in Laodicea, a generation before John's, it likely named the same condition in its earlier form. And here, a genuine and important divergence from the emphases of Colossians emerges. Colossians addresses false teaching primarily as a cognitive and theological problem. Wrong ideas about Christ, wrong frameworks for understanding spiritual reality, wrong practices arising from wrong beliefs. But a pastoral letter aimed at Laodicea's specific wound would have had to address something harder to name and more resistant to argument. Not wrong thinking, but wrong feeling. The comfortable numbness that prosperity produces. The spiritual condition that does not feel like a condition because it does not hurt. This is the kind of letter that would have had to move differently. Slower, perhaps, more personal. Working from the inside out rather than landing the theological argument first and the application second. Consider the figure of Archippus. He appears in 2 of Paul's letters, once in Colossians, once in Philemon. And both references are striking for their urgency. In Colossians, Paul includes what sounds almost like a public charge, instructing the community to tell Archippus to complete the ministry he has received in the Lord. That is an unusual thing to include in a letter, a direct community-witnessed exhortation aimed at a specific individual, carried in writing so that it cannot be privately softened or renegotiated. Archippus may have been the leader of the Laodicean congregation. Philemon, to whom a separate letter was addressed, is widely thought to have been a Laodicean, and Archippus appears in that letter as well, described as a fellow soldier. If the Laodicean letter contained a full, private, sustained address to Archippus, if it named his specific ministry, his specific struggle, the particular ways in which the city's culture of self-sufficiency was making his work harder, then that section alone would represent an irreplaceable window into first-century pastoral leadership. We would know what it looked like for Paul to speak directly into the condition of a leader in a prosperous city who was perhaps struggling to call comfort-numbed believers toward a deeper and more costly faithfulness. And perhaps something was left behind in that letter that no other New Testament document preserved. Paul's other surviving letters each contain material unique to their recipient: Philemon's meditation on slavery and freedom, Philippians' language of kenosis and self-emptying, Galatians' raw, autobiographical urgency. Each letter is irreplaceable, not despite its specificity, but because of it. The Laodicean letter, shaped for its specific city, its specific leader, its specific form of spiritual danger, would have contained pastoral and theological material that appears nowhere else. Ideas in early form that may have been refined in later letters. Arguments calibrated to wealth and comfort that, had they survived, might have become the most quoted Pauline passages in every age of the Church, where material prosperity made spiritual hunger harder to sustain. Imagine sitting in Laodicea when Tychicus arrived. The assembly gathering, in someone's home, in a space large enough for a community, but small enough for intimacy. The scroll unrolling. The voice of whoever was appointed to read it, beginning to fill the room. And for the first time, a community that had been moving through its spiritual life, with the quiet confidence of people who have never had to ask for anything, hearing a voice from chains say something that cut through that confidence like a blade through silk. Not cruel, not condemning, but precise, alive, aimed. This was Paul's gift, the ability to name with love and without apology the exact shape of the thing that was quietly costing a community its soul. That voice is gone. Those specific words have not been heard for 19 centuries. And yet, the community that received them, the wound they addressed, the condition they named, echoes across history with remarkable persistence. Every generation of the Church that has ever had enough has faced some version of what the Laodiceans faced. The letter Paul wrote for them was lost, but the need it addressed never was. This is the significance of the missing text, not as a threat to what the canon preserved, but as evidence of how pastoral and situationally precise the apostolic tradition always was. Every letter was shaped for a specific body of people in a specific moment. The canon preserved what was most portable, most universally applicable, most capable of speaking across contexts without losing its essential power. But the Laodicean letter was maximally specific, and maximally specific letters face the greatest risk when communities scatter. When the copyist who would have preserved it didn't know that it would not be preserved by anyone else, when the chain of careful hands that should have carried it across the centuries was broken by fire or distance, or the ordinary mortality of the people who were its last custodians. So here is the question that this absence leaves open, and I want you to engage with it honestly, because there is no version of this question that has an easy answer. Do you believe the Laodicean letter contained forgotten truths that would deepen and expand our understanding of Pauline theology, particularly his pastoral approach to wealth, comfort, and spiritual complacency? Or do you believe that everything Paul most needed to say to every generation has already been preserved? That the canon is complete not just officially but providentially? That nothing essential was lost, only the particular shape of a particular moment? Both of these convictions, held carefully, lead somewhere rich. Leave your answer in the comments, and read it next to Colossians 4, verse 16, so you feel the weight of the question from inside the text itself. Some absences speak more loudly than some presences. a name written in the margin of a letter that still exists. That is what the Laodicean epistle is now, a margin note, a whisper, an instruction Paul gave that history could not fully carry out. But the instruction is still there, and perhaps the most faithful response to it is exactly what we are doing. Refusing to pretend the silence does not exist, refusing to fill it carelessly, and choosing instead to sit with the question long enough to let it teach us something about the fragility of history, about the breadth of what was once written down and believed, about a first-century church that was far more complicated, far more pastorally nuanced, and far more richly documented than the canon alone can fully show us. The ancient world wrote more than it could carry. We inherited what survived the journey. And everything that didn't survive, every letter, every sermon, every margin note in a scroll that did not outlast its century, is still echoing, faintly, in the documents that did. Listen carefully enough to Colossians, and you can almost hear it. The letter that was supposed to come with it. Still speaking. Still aimed. Still waiting to be received by a city that always believed it had enough, and may not have realized until the scroll was read aloud in a borrowed room that enough and sufficient are very different things. Subscribe and stay with us on this journey, because the ancient world is still revealing itself, one recovered fragment at a time. Like this video if it opened something in you. Share it with someone who loves the early church and isn't afraid of its silences. And we will meet you at the next mystery, because in this series, there is always one more door to open.